Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us, both in person and the people who are joining us online tonight. I really appreciate you coming. I can't really believe that I have to say it after more than a month, after the pointless bloodshed began, but I still need to express our solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Temple Emanu-El is actively involved in supporting the victims of the war, and we hope that you will visit the Temple website and find out how you can help as well. I'm Gadi Levy. I'm the Executive Director of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, and on behalf of the Temple Emanu-El and 70 Face Media, I'm excited to welcome you all. As a home for all things Jewish, the Streicker Center offers programs about history and politics, films, plays, music, and social challenges. But since we are the people of the book, we have a special appreciation for writers and their work. So we are excited that tomorrow night, CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, will join us virtually to trace his journey from Greece, where he grew up in one of the relatively few Jewish families to survive the Holocaust, to Boston, where he led the moonshot that saved the lives of millions across the globe. Next Monday, as a part of a tribute to Leonard Cohen with Judy Collins, Maddie Friedman will join us to discuss his new book about Cohen's experience in the front lines during the Yom Kippur War. Later this semester, playwright David Mamet will discuss his new book about the dangers of free speech in America with Barry Weiss. Tina Brown will be here to discuss her new book about the royal family with Leslie Stahl, and comedian Ali Wentworth will bring some levity to our situation in a conversation about her newest book with Brooke Shields. I hope you will check it out. I hope you will join us, and we're hoping to, we're really hoping to start bringing people back to our place. So now to tonight's event. Between emails, Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat, all promoting causes and social change, people have fallen into the easy belief that going viral with tweets and posting can change the world. But Gal Beckerman, who I must mention, I've known since he was a teenager. He was one of the US Wires, the youth groups in my group at Adat Ariel in the Valley, the Pride of the Valley. I'm very proud of it. This was about, 30 years ago. Okay, so, but Gal Beckerman warns in his new book, The Quiet Before, that radical change does not arise from social media or even demonstration. It demands secluded corners, deep discussions, and time. He joins us tonight to talk about how real change happens over time, and the lessons we need to learn. A writer and editor of the New York Times book and the New York Times Book Review, Gal is the author of When They Come for Us, We'll Be Gone, winner of the National Jewish Book Award, which will also name Best Book of the Year by the New Yorker and the Washington Post. He will be in conversation with the New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg. If you have any questions, Ari, are we doing it by cards or by microphone? If you have any question, we will pass cards. You can write your question. We'll provide it to Michelle. Ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you for joining us. Please welcome Gal Beckerman and Michelle Goldberg. Thank you.
It's so nice to see people.
I know. So thank you all for coming out in person. So I guess, to start, I actually didn't hear that, so I don't know how much of a synopsis of the book you have, but I'm going to ask Gal to just quickly summarize the book for us as a way to lead off the conversation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm thankful that Michelle is here with me. I want to just, hold on, I will just say thank you for a minute because I have an opportunity to Thea Wieseltier, who helped organize this event. I really appreciate it. Some Thea fans. Did she pay you all to come? Is that what happened? The book. The book is really, in its kind of largest iteration, about how newness enters the world. I think that was the kind of the big abstract idea that I wanted to wrestle with, was how do new ideas that change an accepted status quo, a social norm that people have taken for granted, a political reality, how does that change actually begin? And I had a sense that it doesn't begin through a hashtag, that even though that sort of had become a kind of romantic notion that we had about how social media could revolutionize how change occurs, that wasn't really the true process, and that there was something that was missing or being missed in our moment. And so the book is, first of all, sort of a historical search for those other mediums, not social media, but pre-social, pre-internet, going back to, starting with letters before the scientific revolution and going all the way to zines in the 90s, and the way that they sort of, those of you who remember zines, the way they sort of helped get kind of third wave feminism into the bloodstream. So it's looking at all of these different forms of communication and the way they did what social media does not do. And so I took that sort of tour historically, and then the second part of the book uses the accumulated knowledge from having actually looked at all these different historical moments where vanguards were beginning to sort of incubate new ideas, and that helped me sort of understand or look again at what we're seeing today and what seems sort of missing online.
Now, in a way, each of the sections, I'm trying to think if this applies to all of them, but I think that this is true, that most of the sections of the book are also just sort of about, in a very broad sense, literary communities, right? Kind of communities, or at least kind of communities of communication. And, right, this book veers all over the world, all through 500 years.
Yeah, roughly.
But what is it that, I mean, you said before, that social change doesn't begin with a hashtag, but I think one kind of subtext of the book is almost that, like, the hashtag is inimical to the project of social change. So what is it that separates, because it's not just technology. I mean, there's a really interesting section on the alt-right and the way that they're able to kind of organize on Discord servers. So it's not just the technology. What is it that separates the communities where social change, for good or ill, is kind of incubated successfully from the ones where it quickly fires up and then peters out?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, there is a notion that I came to understand was important in each of these instances that I looked at, which was to have some kind of separate, secluded, intimate, sort of like hothouse, where ideas could actually begin to be worked out, where there could be a chance to sort of hash out ideology, to take what often, with these movements, they often start with an emotion, with a sense of disgruntlement about some aspect of our reality. Like, how do you take that and actually turn it into a political agenda? All of the kind of hard work, or even organizing, even the kind of pulling people, recruiting people to a new worldview, where does that happen? How does it happen? And my understanding from looking at these different forms of media that came before the internet was that they provided that sort of space. They provided a place for people to debate. They provided a place for people to begin to sort of cohere as a movement. And what feels missing today is that sort of intimate space. And the contention of the book is that it's partly because social media and the sort of metabolism of social media, the way we've come to sort of think and act on social media, has taken over the lives of these movements.
How much of it is about speed? Because again, like a Discord server is also pretty quick. How much of it is about speed as opposed to kind of privacy and I guess what people call context collapse, which is that in each of the communities that you're writing about, even when people are arguing, you're talking about a group that has either a distinct aim or a distinct
focus.
Set of assumptions so that they don't have to spend a ton of time hashing out first principles or arguing in bad faith. Sort of all the things that
Right.
waste so much
Right.
intellectual energy right now.
I mean, they're also not performing for one another, which is what we end up doing online, right? There's always this notion of we're not really talking to each other. It's like you're talking from a stage, and everyone is watching, and you're aware of the way they're watching, and you're aware of the way that your speech acts are sort of being, molded. They're being molded in order to sort of, attract all these things that we know about our own personal lives and the way we use social media. They're being molded to kind of attract attention, to emotionally trigger some kind of
Right,
reaction.
although that's also true of like the futurist manifestos. There's a whole chapter about
Yeah.
the kind of discursive community, is that the right word, around the futurists,
Right,
and
right.
sort of how they like egg each other on to greater and greater radicalism.
Yeah, but I think, what I think distinguished those, those historical examples is the level of focus, something that you said, which is, this is a group of people that is talking about one thing, and they're trying to develop an idea, they're trying to develop a movement, to try to bring something new into the world together, as opposed to these sites that we have today where we're sort of ping-ponging among different sorts of ideas, So even the futurists, yes, for sure. So the futurists, just to give people just to make this little concrete, Future is a group of artists, Italian artists in the 19-teens who begin to have ideas that they want to sort of remake Italian society. They're not happy with liberal democracy. They're not happy with a sense that that Italy is sort of weighted down with its history, and they want to like literally raise Venice, and they want war, essentially. And so what they are sort of incubating in this chapter, in this episode that I look at, is World War I, or Italy's entrance into World War I. So, and trying to sort of create a mood in Italian society that is hungering for war. So, but their medium, what they're using to sort of refine their ideas in some way, are these manifestos, these sort of absurd, bombastic visions that they're each putting forward about how to change society in very sort of fundamental, violent ways. And so, yes, the manifestos are at one level very sort of public and loud, but they're also a conversation. They're iterative in that, like, somebody will say, this is the manifesto for, how art should be created, how painting should work now, and somebody else comes along and says, I'm going to sort of respond to that and sort of add sculpture to that. And a third person comes and says, this is what we should be wearing these days. So the manifestos are sort of in conversation with each other at the same time that they're talking out loud. So I guess that's the sort of slight distinction.
Okay, and so as you move through the book and kind of social media comes on the scene,
right,
you start to see how it sort of interferes with these processes of community building, or well, it's a complicated process, right? Because on the one hand, it allows, and this is something that my colleague Zainab wrote about in her book, Twitter and Tear Gas, which I think you referenced in your book, that it allows for very quick organization of these kind of attention-getting protests that tend to flame out quickly. And so what is the way that kind of social media, I guess, sabotages the process that you're talking about?
Well, Zainab had a fascinating sort of insight, which I've tried to build on, which was that social media allows everything to happen very, very fast, right? So if you're a social movement and your objective is to, get your ideas to disseminate out into the world, ultimately you want to have a protest. You want to have hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, yelling the same slogan, right? And Zainab came along and said, well, what social media does is it speeds up the ability to do that, right? We all have these incredible bullhorns that we can use that create, that have speed and scale to them, and you can, in no time, make that happen. But what gets lost in that process is building what she calls the internalities of a movement. These are the sort of the elements, the features of a movement that allow people to build strength and be able to subsist, to stand the hardships that come when you're trying to sort of bring about a new idea. So they, in leaping over those steps, it creates real problems, because the day after the protest, you sort of fall apart.
Right, so do you want to talk about how that sort of manifested in Tahrir Square?
Yeah, so Tahrir Square is the ultimate kind of cautionary tale. And it's sort of my first post, once we move from history sort of back, into the last 10, 15 years, Tahrir Square is a really interesting example because, Facebook was on the scene, and Facebook gave this unique group of revolutionaries that came together in Tahrir Square a tool that they felt was unprecedented and revolutionary, which was this ability to call everybody to the square. And it was extremely effective. And it was so effective that there was a little bit of a notion that, this is all we need. Wael Ghonim, who's the kind of main character of that book, who, I don't know if some of you remember, he was the kind of the Google, he was like a marketing director in the Middle East for Google. He was the one who started a Facebook page that really got the ball rolling. And he came to be this proselytizer in the aftermath of the revolution that brought down Mubarak, that all you need is the internet. All you need is the internet, you need social media, you need something like Facebook, and you can make a revolution happen. But the problem was the next day, the day after they brought down the dictator, right? So they achieved their goal, they had their bullhorn, it called the people to the square, they brought down, after 18 days, they brought down Hosni Mubarak, and then what happens? That strange coalition that came together in Tahrir Square needed to become a political opposition, a viable political opposition that could actually contend for power in the country. So to do that, you need to build those internalities, those things that,
What do you mean? I know what she means by internalities, but tell me, what do you mean by internalities?
You need to have an organizational structure. You need to be able to decide amongst yourselves what are our actual goals, what do we want to look like when we're in power, how are we going to make decisions amongst ourselves. You know who had internalities? The Muslim Brotherhood. They had been around for, decades, basically in the underground of Egypt, not really allowed to exist publicly, and they had built up this incredible system of sort of cells, that worked their way up hierarchically, so they knew how to make decisions. They knew exactly what they would want to do if they were ever in power. That was what they had worked out. That's what they had hashed out all those years. And this group of liberal young people in Cairo who were coming from lots of different ideological bents, they had a lot of things they had to work out. And instead, they went on Facebook again. And what did Facebook allow them to do? Just to fight with each other, just to comment on one another's posts, as opposed to having the kind of space where they could have worked out some of these. Look, it was always going to be almost impossible for them to ever really be true contenders for power in Egypt. It was between the Muslim Brotherhood and the army, which was ready to sort of take over again as soon as it found a new head to replace the one that had been decapitated. They were always going to have a hard time. But it didn't help that the medium they thought was the only medium they needed was social media.
How much of it was about the medium, and how much of it is about kind of maybe certain assumptions that have plagued progressive organizing for a long time? I mean, I don't remember if you talk about Joe Friedman's The Tyranny of Structuralism. Do you know this essay?
No.
Okay, so this is an essay written by a kind of radical feminist in the 1970s who had been, she wasn't cynical about the goals of the movement, but she was cynical about the workings of the movement. And one of the things she writes about is in sort of ostensibly non-hierarchical movements that don't have kind of established processes for making decisions.
Yeah.
Hierarchy emerges, but it's a kind of hierarchy that is somewhat opaque and is hard to challenge directly, and that it ends up creating a lot of mutual recriminations and fighting and drama, basically.
Right.
And this, it seems to me that this dynamic that she identified, you just see over and over and over again.
Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street, see it in the Riot Girls.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious how you disentangle, again, like what is about the technology and what is about maybe certain modes of progressive organizing that, are maybe ideologically, they make sense ideologically, but can be impractical.
Right, like ideas about decentralization and how important it is.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, first to say a word about the technology, because I think, I sort of subscribe, it's a little bit a dusty opinion these days, but the Marshall McLuhan notion of the medium is the message. If we know any kind of one slogan from him, it's that. But it sort of hasn't aged well because we think of media now in terms of kind of who has power and who has control. But his notion and a whole generation of these really interesting media theorists from the 60s, some people like there was a guy Walter Ong who looked at how kind of when oral culture became literate culture, how it changed the way our brains work. Their one big insight was that the medium that we use has a deep impact on how we think and what we can think. The notion that every medium we use is like a container, and there are certain things that can go in the container and certain things that won't fit in it simply because of the medium that we're using. So if you think about social media and sort of what it wants, right? We kind of know this language now, kind of popularly, in this notion of what's the incentive structure of a social media? What is when you are committing a speech act on a Facebook or a Twitter, it wants you to be loud. It wants you to grab attention. It doesn't want you to have a quiet, intimate conversation. That's not what the medium. It's not the bias of the medium. It's not what it wants. So the first thing to be said is that I think it's not insignificant that all these movements that I look at historically, they allowed for slowness. They allowed for patience. They allowed for many different voices. They sort of created environments where there could be a much more of a kind of a back and forth. So I think that it is the nature of maybe progressive movements, and I want to talk about sort of the fixation on this idea of decentralization, especially in the last 10, 15 years. But I do think there is something about what you're actually using, the tools you're using to communicate, and what they do to you sort of as a movement, what they do to a group of people, how they allow them to sort of be together. As far as sort of this notion that the best way is for everyone to be able to have a voice, I think that that's a Twitter thing too. I think that there is this sense that because the tools we use are so, they give the impression that everyone has their own megaphone, and everyone's megaphone is as loud as everybody else's, that there's something where that's become sort of overvalued, and there's not enough of a sense, and I think the Occupy people, when you talk to them, they'll say this too, that we were that it was such an important sort of aspect of how we wanted to be as a group that we sort of lost track of, we didn't know how to make decisions amongst ourselves. And I heard that too with Black Lives Matter activists, where they said, here we had, Twitter potentially giving everybody a chance to sort of weigh in and be part of it, but actually some people knew how to do Twitter better than other people, and they gained lots of followers, and they were the people that were then invited to the White House. There's the classic story is this guy DeRay McKesson, who became maybe the most well-known sort of activist from Black Lives Matter in the kind of 2015-16 iteration. And there is, among organizers, there is such a visceral, a hatred of him almost, because here was a guy who, he is an activist. He's a very, he had real skin in the game, but he also just knew how to do Twitter really well, and he was the person who came to sort of speak for the movement, and that that really came to get into a lot of people's skin.
So I want to talk about a kind of paradox here, because you talked about the incentive structure of Twitter. Twitter incentivizes people to be loud, but it also incentivizes, I think, a kind of conformity or groupthink,
right?
Which I want to tease out, because on the one hand, the successful movements that you write about have a certain cohesiveness.
Right.
Right? And you sort of need that to get anywhere. And yet you write about instances in which the sort of the insular nature of Twitter ends up being self-sabotaging. Right.
Well, I think it's about allowing for process, right? Something like just to make this more concrete for the people, to take one of the other examples, the historical examples, because I kind of sort of fell in love with these stories, really, which is what I tried to do in the book, is tell these as stories of, I have one that takes place in 1930s in what we now call Ghana, but was then called the Gold Coast. It was under British colonial rule, and it's a story of a African-owned, one of the first African-owned newspapers at the time, called the African Morning Post, and how that paper became a real forum for people who were beginning to sort of imagine what it would be like to be independent, what it would be like to have their own sort of identity, not as members of tribes, but as part of a nation, what that nation might look like, what its social mores might be, would they be monogamous or polygamous, and all this sort of interesting arguing and figuring it out of people writing. People wrote mostly pseudonymously or anonymously into this newspaper. The newspaper was not the way we think of a newspaper. It was like a professional class of reporters who go out and gather information, but most of it was filled with contributions from readers. The biggest section in the paper was called Grumbler's Row, sort of like Kvetcher's Corner, if it was a Jewish newspaper. And it was just people trying to hash out what a new reality would look like for themselves in this relatively safe space, right? So, that is, at one level you could say, how is that different from Twitter? But I do think, because it is like a bunch of people sort of, in a closed space, sort of, heated, talking amongst themselves. But I think that there is a kind of an unfinished aspect when you read it. There's people's contributions are, responding to one another. They're trying to engage in conversation and debate in a way that I don't think is the groupthink that you're talking about on Twitter happens because everything sort of gets pushed to an extreme of expression, right? Because that's what actually gets you followers. That's what gets you likes. That's what gets people to pay attention to you. Whereas the contributions on that page in the African Morning Post, the grumblers, what made them interesting contributions to those pages is that they were engaging with one another. So I don't know if that sort of illustrates it a little bit. I guess the distinction, yeah.
I want to ask you about the idea of newness.
Yeah.
Another thing that these kind of milieus that are so varied have in common is an ability to sort of imagine a different future.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that is something that we are losing?
Yes. I think I'm trying to also make these more concrete when I talk about them right now. And so take Black Lives Matter, right? And the movement, the various thinking that exists around trying to reform policing, right? I talked to a lot of activists in this movement, and they felt that the slogan "defund the police," which became sort of the catch-all for what people wanted to attain, and that is a kind of a ready-made hashtag Twitter thing. The three words that elicit a strong response from people. A lot of people told me that they felt that at the end of the day, it really undermined their ability to look at the wide range of options and possibilities at a local level for how to make policing work better for their communities. And that's newness, right? There is a lot of newness that's needed in terms of rethinking what it could look like, what relationships with the police could look like. How do you integrate social services sort of into the equation? There's just, or if you take climate change, that's a place where we definitely need newness in the way that we think about how to even present the problem, right? So the reason I brought up defund the police is because in that case, it was another sort of cautionary tale for me of how that social media metabolism, the drive towards that 3-word slogan, the sort of quick way to describe it that would fire people up and get them excited and elicit that emotional response, actually, did a disservice to, what was a very interesting process that was going on in a lot of these activist communities at local levels, trying to engage with communities and figure out what could actually work there. How do you change the local community board? How do you get elected a DA who's going to sort of be sympathetic to your ideas? And how do you compromise too? How do you find the middle ground that might not just turn people off right away, but actually might get some of these ideas, actualized?
But there's also, beyond just the sort of organizational problems, it seems that people have an increasingly hard time. Climate is a good example, right? Because there just seems to be like a terminus.
Yeah.
Because all of our visions of the future, maybe that's I don't even know if that's an exaggeration. So many of our visions of the future are of dystopian wreckage. If you kind of can't, you're not thinking, what kind of a society do we want to live in and how do we get there if you
Right.
feel like you're hurling towards the abyss.
Right. But and that's where I sort of come back to this idea, and I know that when I say it's a little bit 30,000 feet up, but the notion of a need for some quiet spaces, that I feel like if we are to come up with new ways of approaching how not even just to deal with the climate crisis, but just to be able to tell the story of what's happening to the earth, then you need a place, you need some seclusion. You need a place where people can gather together in an intense way, in a focused way, and move away from the kinds of speech and interaction that I feel have become so dominant in our culture. And I do think that it's a kind of a leakage from social media and kind of the places that it's pushed us.
So where do you think those spaces exist, or do they exist anymore?
No, I think they can exist. I'm certainly not like I'm not a unplug the internet person. I think we need to. The first, this book is not meant to be like a, prescriptive, this is what you need to go out and do book.
This is the worst. I would say when I wrote my first book, my editors made me write the kind of what do we do now chapter.
Yeah.
It was the worst. And then people would review it and say that was the
Right.
least convincing part of the book. And,
Right.
Yeah, I know that's the most annoying thing.
No, but it
Now.
actually is quite, it's quite a simple thing that I'm suggesting in the book, which is this kind of a self-awareness about what are the tools that we're using to communicate, and how is that affecting the kind of communication that we can have, that at a fundamental level. So once you appreciate that, once you sort of have that self-awareness and that self-consciousness, then you say, okay, well, maybe if we're a group of people trying to cook something new up in this world, the place to do it is not on a big platform that is performative and loud and fast. Maybe we need to do and you mentioned the white supremacists, and maybe this is a place to bring that in. So I have a chapter.
What we can learn from the white supremacists.
What we can learn from the white supremacists. That's probably what I should have named the book. It would have, my sales would have been a little bit better. What I got access to, and I sort of regretted it as soon as I stepped into it, was there's a platform called Discord, which I don't know if people here know it, but it's for gamers essentially. It's so that they can sort of talk amongst themselves sort of while they're playing killing zombies or whatever people do in games. And but it's really interesting because it has certain features that make it very different from the social media that we know. It's basically closed rooms. You can say these are the 100 people that are going to be in my Discord. They're called servers. And there's a moderator who can decide who gets in there and who doesn't. There are other features like there's no like button, or there's no upvoting. There's nothing that sort of pushes speech towards that performative attention-grabbing thing. It's really, it's kind of like a little bit like the early internet, where it really is sort of trying to duplicate a conversation. Anyways, a few of these servers became very popular spots for white supremacists in the lead up to Charlottesville. In 2017, in the summer of 2017, and so through a leftist hacker group called Unicorn Riot, who had broken into this server, I managed to read tens of thousands of posts that were in this server sort of in the 3 or 4 months leading up to Charlottesville. And for me, it was super interesting because it was an opportunity to see in action the kind of closed, quiet space that I'm suggesting a Black Lives Matter group or a climate activist
they're even
could use.
debating the optics, like all the the khakis and the polo
Yeah,
shirts.
yeah. So what they're doing is first of all, they had a lot of work they had to do because they wanted it was called Unite the Right. They had to bring a lot of different groups together, and there are, as you might imagine, some divisions on, this in that world about, how much the Jewish question. How much should we push the Jewish question? Should we be fully anti-Semitic or just a little bit? And so that's one question. There's the Nazi grandfather, who wants to take part with the swastika on his forehead. He has to be in the same rally as this kind of the young, ironic hipster, what are they called? The Proud Boys, so all of that work of kind of figuring out how to consolidate and how to work together and how to do optics, which was the big concern of theirs. What are we going to wear? What is our flag going to look like? They did a lot of imagining too, what is the world that they want to bring about, And there was an extraordinary amount of earnestness amongst them. It's we think about these groups as being sort of snarky and posting memes and stuff, but they were hey family. There was a real warmth and intimacy if you could look past the sort of sheer awfulness of what they were talking about, and that it felt very productive. It felt like a productive space, and it was unavoidable how productive it was and how much it helped them align themselves for going out into the world, and getting the approval of the president, But it worked for them, and that was one of those moments where I was like, oh, this, and that is sort of what I'm talking about a little bit. Is just understanding that, or even if you look at chat apps, some of the guy who invented Signal, which is one of the more encrypted chat apps, he we think about those apps in terms of the secrecy they provide, and sometimes often we think about it in negative terms, it's providing a space for really awful things to happen, right? But it's he had an interesting way of describing the role that he thought that sort of seclusion and privacy that his chat app creates serves, which is it gives people a place to imagine realities that don't yet exist, because it sort of allows you to fail, allows you to suggest things and fail, allows you to kind of argue with each other in ways that might bring you shame if you did it, publicly. Yeah. Okay,
so I think we're supposed to turn it over to questions soon. I guess let me ask you just one final question, which is you've been an editor first at the New York Times Book Review, now at the Atlantic. How does the discourse, the either participating in it or just being aware of it, how has it changed the way you think and write, and sort of what are the mental habits you have to push against because of it?
You mean actually putting out a book about a topic like wanting quiet and patience
well, or just and kind of in general writing, assigning, deciding who is going who sort of belongs in your pages or not. I mean, I can think of things that the New York Times Book Review did where I think, oh, that was brave given the reaction that inevitably is going to come on Twitter.
Right.
But just having to kind of always be writing in that defensive mode or thinking in that defensive mode.
It is very, very hard to push against that because, we live in a moment when we are, if you're doing what we do, you're also extremely aware of who's reading it, how many people are reading it, how much traffic it's getting, how circulated and how much response and engagement is happening. And it is, I'd say, sort of a daily struggle. And I'm curious to actually hear how you feel about this too, because it is a daily struggle to push against those forces that want you to do the most attention-grabbing thing, as opposed to maybe the most thoughtful and nuanced thing that might land in a place where there's no, it doesn't lend itself to a quick headline or a tweet or the thing that is going to get attention. Because, and you probably know this too, like after you've been doing it for a while, you kind of know what buttons you can push to make those numbers go up. It's obvious in some cases. And so, I don't know, I'd like to think that I try very hard to push against it.
To me, that's not the hard part. The hard part, I don't think, is doing the thing that it can be frustrating to spend a lot of time on something and sort of know that, very few people are going to read it.
Right.
But to me, the hard part is sort of knowing when to stick your head into the buzzsaw and when it's not worth it.
Right. No, I think that's true too. To know. How do you think that it changes your thinking about what kind of columns to write based on the sort of reaction that you think you'll get, online?
I think it's complicated because on the one hand, in some sense maybe it should, right? I think it's changed a sense of who your audience is. So when you could assume that, and I was not at the New York Times at a period where you could assume that your audience was a discrete body of New York Times readers that had sort of, similar assumptions and socioeconomic backgrounds, with exceptions, but that there was a sort of cohesion to the audience. And I think this was true of almost all magazines or all publications, that they foster these imagined communities.
Right.
It's even why something that people used to do in New York Magazine, they used to use we a lot more, right? We do this, we wear, we've made restaurants the new nightclubs or whatever. You could make these kind of statements because you were talking about a distinct group of people, sometimes one that you were summoning into being.
You didn't know who was actually reading most of the time. You had a sense of how many subscribers there were maybe, but at the micro level.
But they almost sort of assumed the authority to sort of summon these subcultures into being. And that has gone because people are going to take umbrage if, how dare you speak for me. And at the same time, that everything is going to be kind of completely decontextualized so that you're going to be attacked by a bunch of people who wouldn't have read things in the past. And so knowing that everything you say is going to be read in the most hostile possible light definitely makes you write differently. And in some sense, I think when I said before, in some sense it should, because I think there was a kind of this pugilistic kind of sensibility that I was raised with, right? The kind of devil's advocate sensibility ends up being, when it doesn't land with people, I guess, in the same, you kind of have, have to share some sort of common assumptions about the Republic of Letters or something, and the value of debate in order to pull it off consistently. At the same time, you don't want to give it up altogether, and so I feel like there's a fine line to walk.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask. So here are some of the questions. Gal, you talked about the Egyptian protesters this is a good one, not being poised to take over after overthrowing Mubarak. Can you talk about January 6 organizers and now are they poised to govern in addition to storming the Capitol?
That is a good question. It's qualitatively sort of different. First of all, there was many more protesters in Tahrir Square, and look, the reason I think that their ability to change Egyptian society sort of fell apart is what they were doing was trying to bring something down, not try to construct something new. And I would argue that maybe those January 6 protesters think that they want to bring about something new. Building something is much harder than tearing something down. And I mean, to me, that would be another major distinction, between those two.
Okay, so someone asked, today's movements need social media. Do you think that movements like ACT UP, specifically during the height of the AIDS crisis, would have benefited from social media? The slowness you spoke about is what killed people.
No, I want to be clear that and this is, I'm glad this question was asked because it gives me an opportunity to be clear. Like, I don't think social media is a bad thing for a movement to use. I think, it's given individual activists and groups an opportunity to be heard above, just whoever could, to be heard louder and further than they ever were before, and that is undeniably a good thing. I think the issue that I have and what I was trying to explore here is the notion that it can't be the only thing. It can't be the only tool in the toolbox. And also part of the problem is that, when you do grab attention in the way that social media allows us to, what do you do when you have that attention? How do you translate it into concrete action and change and actually shifting realities on the ground?
I mean, my sense of ACT UP is that social media probably would have been very useful in terms of some of their concrete demands, like, to kind of get drugs approved faster. You can sort of get a,
I mean, would it, or it would have,
things that lend themselves to a hashtag, but that those relationships and those organizing meetings.
I mean, I think it would have been good at bringing the reality of what it meant to be, dying from AIDS to there would have been, I'm trying to imagine now, it would have, but you can imagine very emotionally grabbing, videos or statements or a hashtag, or something that people would be circulating, and I think it would raise the awareness or bring a conversation about, much in the way Me Too did, and people could tell individual narratives of what it was like to be dying or see people die of AIDS. But then the question of passing legislation to give money to support, searching for cures or to helping to treat people, that's a whole other, that's a level of kind of organizing and political sort of kind of coming together, right, that you need more than that to achieve.
And we didn't talk about disinformation really, but you'll probably, I mean, I remember, the kind of AIDS isn't real, AIDS isn't really caused by HIV, but that was fairly marginal. I have a feeling if social media were around, people would be spending a huge, just much more time having to litigate things like that. You speak eloquently about how social media has affected how we speak performatively. How has social media impacted how we listen?
I like that question. I mean, I think it's those two go together, right? I mean, the same thing that makes it hard for people to actually, engage in this sort of deeper, intimate, more, back and forth conversation that you would have sitting around a table talking with a bunch of people is what makes us sort of become bad listeners too, because you're especially if the bias of the media that you're using is to grab attention, you're not thinking about actually listening and building on the thing that somebody said to you. You're thinking about what's the thing that you can say that can be even louder.
Okay, here's my question is, what is the role, well, firstly, thank you. My question is, what is the role of authoritarianism in the ability of social movements which start online to truly take flight? Never before have governments had more tools to spy on, attack, and prosecute subversives.
I mean, I think I would say it becomes even more important to have quiet spaces. That I mean, I have a chapter in this book that I've been thinking about a lot recently about Samisdat in the Soviet Union, and Samisdat was, of course, underground writing that circulated hand-to-hand, self-produced on typewriters, and it is what kept alive basically a shadow civil society in an extremely authoritarian state where most communication and media was absolutely controlled, down to typewriters. They would have signatures, so you could track down people from anything they had typed. And so, but I think a lot these days, as in the same place in Russia, those avenues of communication are closing down. How important something like Samizdat was, and maybe I don't know if Telegram is serving the same purpose today, of sort of keeping alive, maintaining a sense of resistance and figuring out sort of the best means of resistance, and people kind of being in community together in opposition.
I mean, the other thing is that kind of authoritarian governments have learned from the example of the Soviet Union. So, I mean, I think, look, people are being arrested and prosecuted for their speech. But the other thing that Russia and China, particularly the Philippines, also does this, is they just put out, think of Samisdat wouldn't have been able to function, I would guess, if the KGB was pumping out,
counter Samisdat, yeah.
Or kind of false flag Samizdat, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I mean, that goes into the misinformation and disinformation question in the way that it just muddies things so much in these public spheres that we have online. Yeah.
Sorry, Vicky. I think I only have time for a couple more. Beyond Discord, what, if any, regrets do you have regarding your time on social media?
I could talk about this for a while. No, I'm susceptible to it like all of us. I think that it scratches some very big itch that we all have. It's hard to sort of not get sucked into that drive for attention, for people. It's I think for us in journalism too, we've never had, people didn't have, before something like that existed, an opportunity to engage with readers, engage a response to something that you'd written. You would write something, and that maybe you met somebody at a party who would say, oh, I like that piece you wrote, or you'd get a letter or a phone call, and now you publish something and you right away can see the numbers and whether or not people are sharing it, people are responding to it, people are commenting on it, and that is, we've touched on this a little bit before, but it can be quite dangerous to sort of your compass, in terms of sort of knowing, staying true to what you think matters, in something that you're writing, as opposed to just caring entirely about the response, because
do you think that in terms of kind of productive social media, do you think podcasts fill some of this gap? I mean, I hosted a podcast for a couple of years, and the sort of discussions that you can have on it are different just because people don't hate listen to a podcast. You don't have to be as on defensive in the same way, and they do kind of create a community in the way that some of these other sorts of media I think podcasts are great for that reason. The thing they don't have is the kind of inclusive, you're mostly listening to them, right? But but even the space that opens up when you have an hour to have a conversation with somebody, I'm talking on a podcast itself, feels unique and special to me, given everything else in the culture, it actually is somewhere where I can hear people kind of working out ideas in a way that, a lot of the rest of what we're seeing around us just feels is so kind of reductive. Yeah. Okay. Can you foresee an upside to a decentralized future network of communication?
A decentralized future network of communication? Well, I think a certain kind of decentralization where people are sort of allowed to create these sort of Discord-like chat rooms, where they can decide. These are the people we're letting in. This is the focus of the conversation here, and it's not sort of controlled. The impulses of kind of the types of talk that happens there aren't dictated by, say, like the interests of a private company. I think that could be very positive in terms of the direction that I think things need to go.
Okay, so I'm going to combine two questions. Well, actually, I'm going to combine two questions. I mean, somebody asked what you think about Meta and this kind of hideous quest to put all of human life online. I don't know. I mean, my own sense is that even for my intense pessimism, I feel like it is too awful to succeed.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree.
I mean, I agree, if only because, look at us. We're all here. If we've been reminded of anything over the last 2 years, and it's been wonderful that we've been reminded of it. That basic sort of human desire to be with other people in real space, and where the possibility of spontaneity, of deep sort of intimate connection, and looking into one another's eyes, and what can come of that. We haven't lost that. Even at moments where it felt like everyone got very excited about what kind of possibilities remoteness and virtual connection opened up. There's such a deep hunger that we have for this, and so I take that as a kind of a silver lining of the last 2 years. Yeah.
So, how do you think social media will evolve, and what role, and what is the role of the academy in this future? So I guess, which is an interesting question, because the extent to which sort of academia, the extent to, people complain a lot about academia, but we rarely look to it as a source of the new anymore, which is kind of remarkable.
It's true. And in fact, there are certain aspects of academia and the way academia works that does this thing that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. It's built to do that. To have to create a sign of a safe space where people can try out and test their ideas against each other, right? And when I talk to academics, they feel, and this is obviously a gross generalization, but they feel impacted by this same stuff that we're talking about, this need to grab attention, this need to do research that is going to sort of, the impulse to find sources of money, all of this thing. It's a whole other topic, but I think it is not the pure space anymore, if it ever really was. And in terms of the future of social media, I think another sort of silver lining, and something that I feel is changed even in the course of working on this book for me, is people are much more wary of these platforms. They understand them as being private companies that are pushing us sort of in certain directions in terms of the kind of speech that we can have, the kind of communication we can have on them. I don't think that there's a lot of naivete anymore on this point. Not when it comes to our personal lives and the way we interact with each other, and also not when it comes to these bigger questions of democracy and sort of what it's doing to our democratic institutions, the way it's sort of coarsening things and making things sort of much more polarized. I think where people still have some romanticism is on this question of change, and this notion that if we just put the right hashtag out into the world, it can change people's minds and change the way. I think we're still holding on to that, and so that's the thing I'm trying to chip away at, because I think that if we can apply that same wariness that we do from these other realms to that, it might open up some new possibilities. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for those great questions.
Thank you very much for such an interesting conversation. There are a few copies of the book available for sale. Thank you for joining us. Hope to see you again soon.